If a person applied 2.5 million pounds of compression to their spine multiple times a week for many years, what would happen to their spine? Would it get weaker? Would it get stronger? Or is that just a ridiculous question? And for the record, I didn't pick 2.5 million pounds on a whim. There's a specific reason I picked 2.5 million pounds. And we're going to talk about that later in this video. But I don't think it's a ridiculous question. I think it's obviously a valid question, which is why I asked it, because I think it gets to the heart of what most people with chronic low back pain are dealing with. There's this general belief that if you have chronic low back pain, you need to protect it, or you shouldn't do a lot of work with your back. You need to sit ergonomically. You need to lift with your legs. You need to protect your back. You need to avoid bending. And this mentality is just this strange idea. Like if you have the wrong move, your spine is going to come flying out of your back like some broken jack-in-the-box or something. So the main point I'm trying to get across in this video is that most people should think of their back like a muscle. If you don't use it, it weakens. And if you use it consistently and put a constant load into it, it will become stronger and more resilient. Like every tissue in the body, the back has a certain capacity for how much load it can take. And if you have a consistent capacity and a consistent load, you're in homeostasis, everybody's happy, right? But if you put a very large load into your back all of a sudden, that's exceeding the capacity, then maybe you're going to get injured. But if you also consistently reduce the load by protecting it all the time, we're biologic creatures, right? So we adapt. So what's the capacity going to do? It's going to go down, right? You consistently lower the load, the capacity is going to go down, things will weaken, and you'll be more likely to get injured. However, if you constantly put a slow increasing amount of load in through exercise and whatnot, then the capacity will increase. And as you keep going, the capacity keeps going up and you have a more resilient back, much more resistant to injury, more resistant to pain. So let's start out by looking at that first idea that lowering the load consistently will result in more back pain, more dysfunction. So here's a study looking at adolescent low back pain. And on the left, we have kids who are more physically active. In other words, they probably play a lot of sports and whatnot, as well as having a low sedentary behavior. They have the lowest prevalence of low back pain. And then moving to the right and increasing the prevalence of low back pain, we have kids who are physically active, but also have a high amount of sedentary behavior. So in other words, maybe they play sports, but the rest of the time they kind of sit around. And then we have kids who are not physically active, but they don't have a lot of sedentary behavior. And then the highest prevalence of low back pain is kids who are not physically active and also are very sedentary. Now, when we look at adults, again, it's pretty clear. The study looked at over 360,000 adults over a 12-year period and found that more physical activity equated to less low back pain. Lastly, this study looked at 33,000 adults over a number of years and concluded that replacing sedentary time with equivalent amounts of physical activity demonstrated a reduction in chronic low back pain. So another way of reducing the load on the back is this emphasis on you have to lift properly, which first of all creates a lot of fear in people. But secondly, does it actually reduce pain? Well, there's a lot of studies on this, and what they conclude is strong evidence of no benefit for ergonomics. Manual handling training in isolation is not effective. Evidence does not support the idea that protection prevents pain. However, rather, there's strong evidence that education in lifting techniques or reducing lifting load does not prevent low back pain. And then the last study here, ineffective worker-oriented preventive measures include training in lifting techniques and the using of low back belts. Both are level A evidence. And both of those statements on lifting technique and the use of back belts have level A evidence, which means very, very strong evidence. So if we move to the second part of this idea of increasing the load gradually and keeping more physically active and keeping a load on the spine actually makes you more resilient and less occurrences of back pain and a reduction in chronic back pain. In other words, it can be preventive as well as treatment. I challenged you at the beginning of this video with the question of if you applied 2.5 million pounds of compressive force to your spine multiple times a week for years, what would happen to the spine? So let's answer that question now. First, we have to look at what effect jogging has on the spine. So a runner lands with about 3 times their body weight every step. That works out to a 150-pound person landing with about 450 pounds of compressive load in total. But since only about 60% of the body weight is above the waist, that equals to about 270 pounds of compressive load on the low back with every step. Since most people take about 160 steps per minute, that works out to about 43,200 pounds per minute of compressive load when you're jogging. So if you go for a 60-minute jog, that is about 2.5 million pounds of compressive load on the spine for every hour of jogging. So the question of if a person lands with 2.5 million pounds of compressive load multiple times a week for years, what happens to their spine? There's actually really good studies on this. So let's take a quick look at some of them. In this paper titled "Running Exercise Strengthens the Intervertebral Disc," the researchers showed that exposure to running has an almost linear relationship with lumbar disc hydration and thickness. In other words, the more you run, the thicker and healthier your lumbar discs will be. Okay, so thicker and healthier lumbar discs, great. Does that equate to less pain? Well, it would appear so. In this large review paper that looked at 19 other studies on the topic, they concluded that the incidence of low back pain is markedly lower in runners compared to the general population, and suggest considering prescribing running as a preventive exercise for low back pain. Now, thankfully, I know there's a lot of people out there who don't like to run. That's fine. Running isn't the only way to go. There's a variety of different exercises that you can do, including Pilates, strength training, and others. So let's look at a few of those papers. But rather than going through all the studies, which are very numerous, we can just look at one study that already did that for us. This study looked at 45 other studies and found, quote, beneficial effect for strength and resistance and coordination and stabilization exercise programs over other interventions for treatment of chronic low back pain. And then, contrary to the idea that protecting your back is important, this massive review paper by the prestigious Cochrane collaboration concluded exercise programs starting 4 to 6 weeks post-surgery seem to lead to faster decrease in pain and disability than no treatment, and high-intensity exercise programs seem to lead to faster decrease in pain and disability than low-intensity programs. And then, speaking of high intensity, this study that was just released in 2024 looked at adults with chronic low back pain and found that general strength exercises were superior to low-level motor control exercises. However, they found that, quote, higher participant-reported intensities led to greater reductions in pain intensity. So, in other words, the harder you work out, the more intense you do your rehab exercises, the less pain you'll have. And then they go on to say, quote, when designing a general strength and conditioning program for individuals with chronic low back pain, training intensity and volume may be important variables to consider, with increased training intensity and volume associated with improvements in pain intensity. Now, to me, that doesn't sound like the classic idea of protecting your back with low back pain. If we take a look at all of these studies that show reducing your load increases the prevalence of low back pain, teaching someone to lift properly doesn't do anything to reduce low back pain. It's very ineffective. And then on the flip side, running, where you apply 2.5 million pounds of compression to the spine every hour of jogging, and then other studies that show like the more intense your rehab exercise, the more likely you are to have a reduction in low back pain and even less prevalence of low back pain, so it seems to be protective. That doesn't jibe with this idea of like, hey, let's protect the back. However, I am not saying that everybody with chronic low back pain needs to run and do intense exercise. Obviously, not every exercise is going to be applicable to every person, right? The reps and sets and intensity is going to depend on your age. It's going to depend on comorbidities, like if you have diabetes or if you're overweight, or these things that really affect your ability to adapt. In other words, for the capacity of the tissue to increase as you increase the load, right? So it's all on a personalized level. So here's the take-home point. Movement and exercise seem to be beneficial for preventing and treating chronic low back pain. Habitually protecting the back will likely lead to detraining, right? And disuse atrophy of the muscles and the discs, the bones, the joints, everything in the low back. And yes, applying 2.5 million pounds of compression to the spine a few times a week in the form of running does seem to be protective for low back pain. So thanks for watching. I'm hoping that this video adds to your knowledge and understanding of chronic low back pain. And if you like the video, please click the subscribe button and the thumbs up button and the share button and share it with whoever you think might benefit from it. All right, thanks. Bye.